So just for video purposes today, this is the audience today is fellow faculty and staff at Hudson Montessori, which I sincerely thank for coming out and supporting me. I appreciate it. So today I would like to give a glimpse of my exploration that I've been working on through the TIES master's program at Endicott College. Just to give a brief background, Endicott College is a small school just north of Boston, and I found out about their master's program because they offer it in conjunction with my Montessori training through METC, and going through them at the same time kind of offered not only more of a in-depth philosophy look at Montessori in conjunction with my training, but it also offered an opportunity for me to get my master's at the same time as my training, and a little bit of overlap always helped as well. And so just a few disclaimers I'd like to put out there. This is really a glimpse into an ongoing exploration that I have not yet completed, and which will continue beyond just turning in my thesis and finishing my master's. This is not intended to be a list of answers. It's also not intended to be conclusions that are explicitly made. I think that that would be kind of disingenuous to the process of this, which is more of an exploratory process. In fact, there's probably going to be more questions raised than answers given, which I think is the sign of maybe a good exploration. There is also an assumption that I am making of some prior experience with Montessori philosophy and readings, particularly in regards to the planes of development, cosmic education, and peace education. That's also why I felt that for at least this first presentation of this exploration, that this was an appropriate audience for that. Also, in any quotes, the pronouns have been kept in their original format, so any pronouns that do not confirm with modern standards are done so because they've been kept in their original format. So just a brief outline. I'd like to start by looking into the concept of cosmogenesis, the story of our cosmos, of our universe, and how that kind of lays the foundation for Montessori cosmic education. I'd like to look at the beginnings of transpersonal psychology, especially the two heavy hitters, Abraham Maslow and Carl Jung, and how their foundational ideas in psychology, I think, really align with what Montessori was doing in terms of developmental psychology. And then I'd like to look at the tricky substance of self-transcendence and really kind of make a case for what self-transcendence is, and maybe try and come up with a few more practical ideas of self-transcendence and how that relates to Montessori's idea of a new human and moving forward in education for a new human and a new world. And then I'd like to take a path down and look at how Buddhist mindfulness, insights in practice, relate to this idea of self-transcendence and the cosmic task. And then kind of briefly introduce a relatively new field of neurophenomenology, which I believe has a lot of implications for the Montessori classroom and just our own personal wellness. And then kind of wrap it up posing some further questions of exploration. So first, I'd like to start with just perhaps in our small groups here, a little discussion, if you will, just to kind of get our minds going in the right direction. What stories, and by stories, this does not connotate make-believe. It could be a rock-solid faith that you have, or whatever it may be. What stories do you have that place you in context with the greater world around you? This could be going back to from your childhood. This could be a faith-based religion that you practice. It could be something scientific. But what stories do you have? And maybe this quote will get us started. We reveal ourselves in the metaphors that we choose for depicting the cosmos in miniature. So to keep us on time, let's say 3 minutes, and maybe just with the folks around you, you could discuss some of the stories or metaphors that you use to place yourself in context with the world.
fact that people don't speak the same language gives you a sense of vastness of the world. He mentions everything, so I think that's places what's the role of
pressure and care. So what these really go to and play out actions. First things because we covered that. It was a savage and it's just gathering some stories of like and so it's just, whenever I do say it's kind of the imprinted on it. It's something that is what you read and you take care of it. Like what lines of people that they could carry it yourself. And I know incidences in my childhood, the oddest things I remember, but probably not the ones that they wanted me to hear. So that's where it's like, it's probably just not honest. So it's kind of, I get scared like the impact that I have on my
So, as a personal anecdote, I found myself throughout this exploration kind of shying away and hesitating at the word story a little bit, because story sometimes carries connotations that it might not necessarily take the seriousness that we would like it to have, or take the proper amount of justification that we believe our value systems and deriving our meanings come from. But if we look at humankind, we've been telling stories since the dawn of time, and these stories, I would say, and it's not my original idea, but were never meant to be taken literally. I believe that these stories, since the dawn of time, have always meant to carry a mythology from which humans have derived their value systems, through which humans have derived the way and the meanings with which they interact with the world around them and the way that they interact with each other. Memes, cultural memes, archetypes, and mythology have always, for humans, carried, and we've played out these stories over millennium. And they do have cultural differences, but one thing that's amazing is that looking at many of the creation stories or mythologies or religions across the world is that we find humans playing out the same archetypes regardless of culture. And many of these stories we know as organized religion today as well. And so what I would say, and I think that what really Montessori was getting at with the basis of cosmic education, is that the universe itself and cosmogenesis can be a story from which we derive value and from which we derive meaning in our relationship with the world and the relationship with others around us. I think that this image is perhaps the most profound image that humans have ever created. Does anybody know or want to take a gander or a guess at what this is? Nothing. Yeah, it is a map of sorts, absolutely. So this is what is known as cosmic microwave background of the universe. This is the entire observable known universe to us. And this image was first discovered in 1964 on accident by Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, who were working at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Holmdel, New Jersey. And they were pointing radars at the sky, and they were getting a background noise that they couldn't get rid of. And to the point where they went into these giant radars and they scrubbed it with bleach because they thought it was pigeon droppings. And this noise kept coming back at them. And finally, they happened to read Stephen Hawking's article one day and realized that this is the actual image of the Big Bang. This is the background microwave still left from the original Big Bang 13.7 million years ago that is constantly reverberating throughout the cosmos. So this is the beginning of the story of cosmogenesis. And this is truly the beginning of Montessori's concept of cosmic education. Give the child the universe and work in from there. And so along my path of understanding cosmogenesis and understanding the way in which value structures and meaning can be derived from cosmogenesis, one of the ways and one of the kind of tributaries I went down was the idea of chaos theory and self-organization. Briggs and Pete write a seminal book on chaos theory, and they define chaos as the scientific term chaos referring to the underlying interconnectedness that exists in inherently random events. Chaos science focuses on hidden patterns, nuance, the sensitivity of things, and the rules for how the unpredictable leads to the new. And chaos theory was really eye-opening for me because it affirmed much of my instinctual interpretation of the world. I spent a lot of time throughout my life alone in the woods. And in my interpretation of the world, I've seen self-organization and creativity out of seeming chaos. And so the idea that there was actually a science and a discipline devoted to this was really affirming to me in my interpretation. And what chaos theory really does is it rethinks the Cartesian model of the world. And I want to make a public apology to René Descartes right now, because although he was, I believe, a brilliant man and a great thinker and attributed and influenced much of Western society, I will be using his last name in a fairly negative connotation today. And so on the left we have Sir Isaac Newton, and on the right René Descartes. And the natural laws laid out by Newton and the analytical approach to knowledge and understanding by Descartes at the Enlightenment and the late Renaissance led to a paradigm shift in Western society, in which the objective world was looked at as knowledge could be derived through an analytical way of thinking and an analytical way of breaking down the world into reductionist parts. Everything was a machine. If we understood the parts of the machine, we could understand the machine as a whole. The planets were just parts of a machine that were working in conjunction through the laws of gravity. Our bodies are simple machines that can be understood by breaking it down to its simplest parts. This was a reductionist view that held that the whole is the sum of its parts. And this line of thinking, within the last 100 years or so, has started to be challenged more and more. One person who first challenged this was a French scientist, Jules Henri Poincaré, and he was a French scientist, and he was studying this motion of the planets. And what he was realizing when he studied the motion of the planets is that very, very small influences of gravity could generate feedback loops, and those feedback loops could magnify that first original influence to the point where it creates a critical point that influences massive change along a system. And this is kind of similar to, I think we've all heard the butterfly effect, right? Where a butterfly flaps its wings in China and it creates a tornado in Oklahoma. This is kind of a similar metaphorical concept along that. Only this was not metaphorical. He was seeing these changes in the motion of planets. And what he was really talking about was resonance. And the idea of resonance is that resonance occurs when systems vibrate or swing in sympathy with each other, so that just the tiniest connection between the parts of a system progressively magnifies their mutual interaction. And so we're talking about feedback loops. And what he's starting to say is that it is not the objects themselves in a system that make the system. It is the relationship between objects that make the system and are what actually constitute the system. And so what we're saying here with Poincaré and chaos theory is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We cannot understand the whole just by understanding its individual parts. This image delineates an example of self-organization in nature. So this is a liquid that has had a metallic substance added to it just to create the visual aspect of it. And what this is this is a liquid that is brought to just the brink of boiling. And just before you get it to boiling, it itself creates these hexagonal columns of convection currents. And so in chaos theory, this is what would be known as a bifurcation point. This is the point where a substance or a system allowed a degree of freedom, in this case the temperature of the water allows that degree of freedom, will at some point become creative instinctively. This is a natural creation that is self-organizing in nature. And the more that I began to think this way, and the more that I began to think as matter and nature being inherently self-organizing and self-creative, the more I saw it all around me. Whether it being the motion of snow melting from a sidewalk, whether it be the path that a river takes through a forest, whether it be the way that roots go around rocks, whatever it is, nature is inherently self-organizing, all the way from the structure of the atom to the matter accumulating in galaxies. And what this leads to is it leads to what's known as a systems approach to the universe. And this was really started, at least in the Western sense, a scientific sense, this really started in the early 1900s when some brilliant thinkers started to come up with the idea of ecology. And ecology is really seeing those relationships on a broader scale. One of the founding really minds, and one of the great minds, Aldo Leopold of ecology, made this statement in 1923: "It is at least not impossible to regard the Earth's parts, the soil, the mountains, the rivers, the atmosphere, etc., as organs or parts of organs of coordinated whole, each part with a definite function." And so ecology, I think we kind of take it for granted now because it has, I think because it was such a great idea and really gets to the truth of where we are, the systems we are living in. But I think it's important to historically note that in 1923, not even 100 years ago, this was a completely earth-shaking radical idea. The idea that things were so interrelated, and that something that I did to an upstream river would have effects miles and miles away. This was unheard of at the time. So we haven't really come that far in idea of systems approach and understanding the relationships of things. Gaia theory. In the 1970s, two scientists, James Lovelock and Lynn Margulies, developed the idea of Gaia theory, looking at the entire Earth as one living organism that is self-controlling in terms of climate, atmosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, all parts of one system that is self-controlling and self-organizes itself to produce life and all of the magnificent things that we have here on Earth. And really the Earth completing homeostasis for itself, taking care of itself. And then modern leaps into quantum physics have basically just completely destroyed the foundation of Cartesian thinking. I don't claim to know very much about quantum physics, but what I do know of it and read of it, there's just some really weird stuff going on that doesn't make sense to many people. And so it kind of destroys that Cartesian way of thinking of reductionists. And if this all sounds familiar, I hope it does, because this is something that Montessori was realizing at an extremely early time in this advent of this thinking. This is from To Educate the Human Potential in 1948. "The stars, earth, stones, life of all kind form a whole in relation with each other. And so close is this relation that we cannot understand a stone without some some understanding of the great sun. No matter what we touch, an atom or a cell, we cannot explain it without knowledge of the wide universe." And so what constantly amazes me about Montessori is how ahead of her time she was, and how in tune with her contemporaries she was. Many ecologists weren't even reaching this level of acceptance of the relationship, interconnectedness of things that she was reaching in 1948. And although I don't have the time to go into it at great depth, I do think it's worth noting that To Educate the Human Potential and her cosmic education with Mario really came into the fold when she was in India in the 1940s during World War II. I doubt that cosmic education would have had the same tone to it, the same commitment to relationships and ecology if she had not been in India at this time. I believe that was an extremely important place for her to be and for Mario to be to really develop this fully. So when I was trying to process all of this and understand it as a truly paradigm shift, one thing, concept that that really stuck in my head almost immediately was the idea of a holon or a holarchy. So on the right is a diagram of kind of a traditional way that we think about relationships or systems in terms of a hierarchy. Things feeding energy up through a hierarchy. The holon was a word that was coined by a science fiction writer in 1967, Arthur Koestler. And what a holon comes to represent is something that is simultaneously its own being as well as being a part of another greater system. So the cells in our body. I can pick out an individual cell in my body. That cell is individually its own entity while simultaneously being part of a larger system. We are all our own people while simultaneously being part of a larger organization or society or whatever it is. A holarchy is a nested relationship of holons all in communion with each other. And while I think it might be easy to write this off as just kind of nitpicking at definitions, I do truly believe that I have personally benefited from kind of shifting my paradigm of thinking about the world and systems in terms of hierarchies and shifted it to more of a nested relationship thinking and thinking of the relationship between parts as opposed to those parts themselves in some type of hierarchical structure. Okay. I'd like to transition a little bit now from cosmogenesis towards transpersonal psychology. So these are two of the really founding thinkers within transpersonal psychology, Carl Jung on the left and Abraham Maslow on the right. And I'm sure this graphic is fairly recognizable to most of us. This is Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs. And so one very important concept I think I'd like to highlight here is the idea of prepotency. The idea of prepotency, Maslow lets us know, is that some needs must be met at some sort of satisfactory degree before the other needs manifest themselves. So for instance, our needs of being a social being don't really matter much if we're starving and freezing on the ground. Right? These needs have to be met to some satisfactory level in order for the higher needs to manifest themselves. And I think this is an extremely important point, but I also think that he does a great job of nuancing that by saying that there is some arbitrary level. Let's say that each need has a range of satisfaction from 0, unsatisfied, to 100, completely satisfied. Not every need need be satisfied to 100 for the other needs to show themselves. We do not need to have our social lives clicking at a 100% satisfactory level to have a need of feeling accomplishment in our lives and be a motivational factor. And I think this is important, especially when we start to talk about self-actualization and later on self-transcendence. And just a note of definition here, Maslow referred to these first 4 needs, self-worth, self-esteem, our social needs, our needs for emotional and physical safety, and our basic physiological needs as D needs or deficiency needs. Meaning that if any one person was lacking in any of these needs, they would be an inherently unhealthy person. It takes these needs to be satisfied to be a healthy person. And I believe that this flows right into a concept of Montessori's normalization. Normalization was and still is a tricky concept for me, and I think a tricky concept for many Montessorians. I must admit that at the first read-through of trying to understand normalization, I was quite put off by it. And I think it was just the connotation of the word normal. I think it kind of connotates something that maybe got lost in translation. It wasn't necessarily her original intent. I think understanding these D needs of being a fully functioning, healthy person is maybe more along the lines of normalization that Montessori was getting at. This is from Formation of Man, 55. In consequence of this normalization, the children do not become obedient to a teacher who gives them lessons and corrects them, but they find their guide in the laws of nature, or perhaps the motivational needs, that they start again to function normally. And Maslow talks about this in terms of individuality and individual freedoms. And this is starting to get to the heart of the primal paradox. Maslow on individual freedom, these conditions that maximize the beneficial, the optimization of individual freedoms, these conditions are not ends in themselves, but they are almost so, since they are so closely related to the basic needs, which are apparently the only ends in themselves. So saying that individual freedom is the quintessential path towards these basic needs and fulfilling these normal needs, if you will. Montessori in Education and Peace. The only true freedom for an individual is to have the opportunity to act independently. That is the condition sine qua non of individuality. There is no such thing as an individual until a person can act by himself. The instinct guiding the child to seek his independence thus leads us to realize that the whole of nature demonstrates that any sort of association is composed of separate individuals. And this, to me, gets right to the heart of my exploration, which is the primal paradox. This is Montessori's grandson, Mario M. Montessori Jr., a psychologist himself. Human development is the result of an unconscious creative activity of the individual, and that this process is only possible in association with others. It is only in the community that man's potentialities can be realized. So the primal paradox is understanding that we as individuals must develop ourselves to our maximum benefit and potential, while also expressing that potential within the context of a society. And the interplay between that is really what my exploration has been about and focusing on, and understanding how to understand that interplay and how to understand that interplay within the elementary classroom and within human development. So Maslow goes on to talk about self-actualization, the top of that first pyramid. In his theory of human motivation, he says that even if all these needs, the D needs, are satisfied, we may still often, if not always, expect that a new discontent and restlessness will soon develop unless the individual is doing what he is fitted for. A musician must make music, an artist must paint, a poet must write. If he is to be ultimately happy, what a man can be, he must be. This need we may call self-actualization. Jung had a very similar concept, and he called this individuation. And he really put the individuation not as a noetic or a mental property, but truly as a biological, physical manifestation, an expression of that biological process by which every living being becomes what is destined to become from the beginning. To individuate is to realize one's personal existence as a unique expression of humanity. To me, this is exactly in line, exactly in resonance with what Montessori's concept of the cosmic task was. And I think one of the brilliant parts about Montessori was that she extended this idea of individuation or self-actualization beyond just the human life into ecology in the greater world. When Montessori talked about the trilobites or any other part of ecology or geology or geography or even math and geometry, she spoke of cosmic tasks and the cosmic task of individual beings. And to me, the cosmic task, Jung's individuation, and Maslow's self-actualization are really almost synonymous concepts. Maslow himself was rightfully pretty critical of his first work. He felt it left a lot to be desired, and he felt it was misinterpreted in many ways. In 1971, he further developed his concepts in a book called The Further Reaches of Human Nature. And in this, he really talked about self-transcendence and added a new layer to the hierarchy. In his own words, self-transcendence is the greatest attainment of identity, autonomy, and selfhood. Is simultaneously a transcending of itself, a going beyond and above of selfhood. The person that can then become relatively egoless, I wish to underscore one main paradox. The goal of identity, or self-actualization, seems to be simultaneously an end goal in itself and also a transitional goal, a rite of passage, and a step along the path of the transcendence of the identity. I think it's important to note here that Maslow himself thought that truly self-actualized people were very rare in society. He did not think that this was just a natural course that all humans or all adults end up at. He felt that self-actualized people were quite a rarity. He felt that truly self-transcendent people, he gave a list of maybe a handful of them that he could think of off the top of his head. That's not to say that we don't all have moments of self-transcendence in our lives. He would refer to this as moments, how fleeting, of egoless, where we lose ourselves and we lose a true connection with what our self is, even for just a moment. He would call these peak experiences. He also said that working towards self-transcendence, if that is a goal of somebody, is to work more towards plateau experience that might be more beneficial than true peak experiences. And so I'd like to delve into that a little bit more, what that might mean. Viktor Frankl, the famous author of Man's Search for Meaning and a Holocaust survivor, says this about self-transcendence. The more one forgets himself, the more human he is, and the more he actualizes himself. What is called self-actualization is not an attainable aim at all, for the simple reason that the more one would strive for it, the more he would miss it. In other words, self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence. So again, here we're seeing layers upon layers of paradox and interplay between competing forces. And this really forced me to kind of take a step back and rearrange the hierarchy a bit, especially if I'm going to take into and hold true to my new paradigm of trying to move away from hierarchies and think more in a systems way. This is a systems mapping exercise that I went through. This is kind of a crucial part of the TIES curriculum. We system map quite a bit as we're reflecting upon the information we're taking in. So this is a systems map I created of the primal paradox. And I think I want to do justice to Maslow here in saying that I don't know that the hierarchy was ever his intention for his ideas. I think the hierarchy was something that other people kind of took and ran with and attributed. He himself says that within the sphere of motivational determinants, any behavior tends to be determined by several or all of the basic needs simultaneously, rather than only one of them. So I want to make sure I'm doing justice to Maslow here. These two green circles represent the primal paradox in itself. The needs of individuation and the path of the individual within context and the poles of the society and the community. The red dot represents the stability of the whole system. Here I have chosen the red dot to be autopoiesis. Well, I'll talk more about the definition of autopoiesis later, but autopoiesis is essentially the basic definition of what it means to be alive and to be cognitive. The purple dot here represents the creative phase of the system. I've chosen this to represent a self-actualization, because self-actualization is where the potentiality of the individual is played out in the context of the society. The yellow dot in the center is the unity point of the system. This is where all of the system works together in the individual as one expression. Self-transcendence is the expression of one individual's potentiality along with the optimum trajectory of the greater society or system. The orange dot is the resource base. This is our basic D needs. Without these satisfactorily met, none of this can happen. The blue circles are feedback loops. This is information being taken in through all points of the system. And the outer ring is the external impacts upon the system. Structural coupling is the entanglement of individuals in their environment. We have the environment themselves, the natural and intrinsic aesthetic and beauty of matter and existence itself, and consciousness. So what of Montessori and the primal paradox? Again, from Education in Peace. Education must foster both the development of individuality and that of society. Society cannot develop unless the individual develops, as we learn from observing the child, who immediately uses his newly won independence to act on the social environment. So although she didn't directly name the primal paradox, to me this is exactly the heart of what the primal paradox is getting at. And I also believe that she was calling for self-transcendence in terms of her view of what it means to form a new human. This is also from Education in Peace. This harmony based on the need of each and all is of divine origin, and that is why man has no conception of it and perceives only his own immediate needs. But if man could raise his consciousness, self-transcendence, to a higher level, he would awaken to become aware of the disinterested goodness and the self-sacrifice of his fellows. If we educate children to see this, they will ready themselves to feel gratitude towards all mankind. This is an effective aspect of our cosmic education. So here, I really believe that she is saying that self-transcendence and creating an environment and fostering an environment which allows children to work towards and see self-transcendence as an attainable value is truly the ultimate goal of cosmic education. Before I go any further and really delve into more of the practical terms of speaking of self and self-transcendence, I'd like to pause for a second and give a moment for some reflection and some dialogue on what activities or moments, no matter how seemingly minuscule, how seemingly benign or trivial they are, in your life can you recall that lead towards a loss of self? Other names that could be thought of as a metaphor for this are flow, in the moment, out of body, moments in which we forget that we are ourselves for a second. And if we could take just a minute or two just to either individually reflect or create a little dialogue, I think that would be beneficial here.
I can remember when I was but I'm wondering if that's back to but my first go-to so really
I was going to say right as well.
So some anecdotal commonalities that I think I just kind of overheard here, as well as just talking about this outside of this group with other people in my cohort, is that place seems to usually play an important role in these experiences in our lives, whether it's some kind of just absolutely breathtaking or ethereal experience for us in terms of place. Also, that these moments, however fleeting, in which we truly lose our self-identity, and when I say lose, sometimes these have kind of negative connotations. We're losing our self-identity because they can be kind of scary concepts. But in my personal experience, these are moments of great meaning and moments of really some of the purest joy that I think I've experienced in existence. Is they have an ineffable quality to them that it's hard to put into language, right? It's extremely hard for us to recall and to explain these in another way. And some of that is because it just kind of sometimes seems downright silly. And sometimes it's just language can only go so far in explaining our own experiences. And that's why so much I think of self-transcendence and ego loss is related in other forms of communication, as artwork, as sculpture, as music, as dance, as all of these other beautiful human endeavors as well. The next part of this presentation, I feel as though I'm taking a bit of a risk, but I'm glad that you're taking that risk with me. I think that some of these things can be perhaps a little bit, I don't know if radical is the right word, but they can be a bit scary, and they can be scary for me sometimes as well. I think that there is an illusion of self. I think, and this is certainly not an original thought of mine, I think that where we look as humans, whether it be religion, science, psychoanalysis, philosophy, meditation, there is a self that cannot be found to exist in any independent fashion. I think there is an illusion that we create in which there is a controller or someone at the controls in our brain that lives in the space behind our eyes. I think that this illusion plays out in the idea of autobiographical memory. I can tell you a story of myself. I can tell you that I was born on this day in Shaker Heights. My mom tells me that it was snowing that day, and that's why I love winter. So there are stories that I can tell you about myself, and many of those stories aren't even things that I personally remember. They're stories that have been told to me about me. I think that that's one side of the illusion. I think the other side of the illusion is that we have this sense of executive control. I can decide to pick up this, this mug, and no one else, I believe, in this room put that idea in my head, so I have this idea of executive control, that I have executive control over that. And I think that's the basis for this illusion. And I think it's very easy and very natural for us to grasp for an identity of self. And I think some of this goes back to the interplay between religion and science. When the Enlightenment and when science and the Western analytical thinking of philosophy first came around, it really undercut some of the foundations of faith-based religions. And Nietzsche pointed this out and was very worried about this, and he called this the death of God. And he was worried about this mostly from what this would do to our value structure as humans. And Varela points out that we as humans must learn to live in a world without foundations. But science alone is not capable of doing this, especially a science that has no bridge to everyday human experience, is incapable of tasks. Many great thinkers in analytical thought are very critical of the fact that science, in a purely objective manner, has undercut many of the value systems and has, in essence, thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Because science and many analytical thinkers and rationalist thinkers didn't like the answers to the questions that religion was giving, they threw out the questions along with the answers. But the questions I think we're realizing have a lot to tell us about ourselves, about human nature, and about meaning in life. Which kind of leads to a tricky word, spirituality. Spirituality is a tough concept for me. I really enjoy and I really like Sam Harris's definition of spirituality in his book, Waking Up. He defines spirituality as, although such experiences of self-transcendence are generally thought about in religious terms, there is nothing uniquely or exclusively religious about them. From both a scientific and a philosophical point of view, they represent a clearer understanding of the way things are. Deepening that understanding and repeatedly cutting through the illusion of self is what is meant by spirituality in the context of this book. I think that's a valuable definition for spirituality. And I believe it's something that Montessori herself was also getting at. Montessori often spoke of the Montessori teacher as having three main qualities: that of the tactician, that of the scientist, and that of the saint. A technician in the idea of the way that we present our curriculum and our lessons and the way that we are modeling ourselves in an extremely intentful and matter-of-fact way. A scientist in the way that we are using objective observation and experiments within our environments. And a saint in the way that we appeal to the spiritual nature of the soul of the child. In Education and Peace, she says, in going about his dedicated labors on behalf of the child, the adult must realize above all else that his task concerns a revelation of the child's soul. If he does so, the steps he subsequently takes and the aid he offers the child will be of great importance. If he does not do so, all his work will go for nothing. So she's putting the top priority of the Montessori teacher as that saint aspect, as appealing to the soul of the child. Even going so far as to say any other work that has been done in the classroom is going for nothing if that is not a part of it. So why Buddhism? In my exploration, I had a vague idea that at some point it would tend towards Buddhism, and it has done so more recently in my exploration. And I'm glad that I was patient in this process, because I don't know that I would have come to it with such an open mind and such an availability if I had forced it earlier in the process. Buddhism and the insights into consciousness, I think, are valuable for a couple reasons. One is that Buddhism is approachable from a non-religious standpoint. Buddhism is certainly not the only human endeavor that has something to say about the natural nature of consciousness or self-transcendence. But it doesn't require a conversion of sorts. It doesn't require a faith-based belief in a deity that might take years to develop, or it be culturally based. And it also doesn't necessarily require adherence to a dogmatic tradition. Buddhist is a record of thousands of years of experience devoted to the understanding of consciousness from an individual perspective. I think there's also inherent value in it being non-Western. So much of our paradigm is not explicitly, but unconsciously influenced by the analytical, philosophical, scientific paradigm of Western thought. And so Buddhism being non-Western and being outside of that paradigm, I think, is inherent value. So what do the Buddhists have to say? There is a fundamental notion of dukkha, which is suffering. And this is that mind is constantly grasping for that foundational self. And it is from this constant grasping that all suffering and anguish and stress arises. Varela explains that the philosophical challenge that Nietzsche faced, which has come to characterize the task of postmodern thought, is to lay down a path of thinking and practice that gives up those foundations without transforming itself into a new foundation. Which leads us to the concept of emptiness. The Buddhist word for emptiness is sunyata, and empty being sunya. All things are empty, sunya, of intrinsic existence, because everything arises codependently. And what is meant by that, it really goes back to the idea of systems thinking as everything being in relationship with something else. Nothing exists in isolation in this existence that we know. Nothing in the universe exists in and of itself. Everything exists in relation to other things. And this is really what is meant, I think, by the concept of emptiness or sunyata. That things are inherently codependent on others, and so they are empty of intrinsic, their own being. The result of this grasping at emptiness from the human mind is an oscillation between absolutism and nihilism. The grasping mind leads one to search for an absolute ground, for anything, whether inner or outer, that might be virtue of its own being, or be the support or a foundation for everything else. And then faced with this inability to find such ultimate ground, the grasping mind recoils and clings to the absence of that ground by treating everything as an illusion. Okay. This oscillation is known as the Cartesian anxiety. Sorry, Descartes. In the Cartesian ideal, I think, therefore I am, the mind is a mirror of nature. The knowledge exists in a pre-given exterior objective world, and all we have to do is be smart enough, be analytical enough, and be observant enough to extract that knowledge to ourselves. This really challenges that. This says that the Cartesian anxiety will fold in on itself when there is no true ground, and that nihilism can be an offshoot of that Cartesian anxiety. This is really heavy stuff. So I think it's important for me to take a breath sometimes and realize that there are layers of truth. There is relative and ultimate truth, right? Relative truth, or samvarti, which literally means covered or concealed, is the phenomenal world just as it appears to us. Chairs, people, species, the coherence of all those things through time. However, ultimate truth, paramartha, is the emptiness of that very same phenomenal world. The Tibetan term for relative truth is kunzap, or kunzap captures the relation between the two imagistically. Kunzap literally means all dressed up or costumed. That is, that relative truth, sunyata, relative truth is sunyata, emptiness, costumed in the brilliant colors of the phenomenal world. We are excused for enjoying the phenomenal world, right? This is what existence is. But I think that acknowledging, at least for me, that ultimate truth is a first step towards the path of true self-transcendence. Realizing that emptiness and realizing it compassionately. We are consciousness embodied in the world in autopoiesis. The definition of autopoiesis is a self-organized system capable of making itself in relation to its environment. It's the basic definition of life. And everything, this goes back to codependence, is structural coupling. Any system is entangled in its relationship with the environment. Both act upon itself to influence the other. And so Varela really comes at this from a warmth perspective. This is not a cold world that we live in. Instead of being embodied, more accurately re-embodied every moment, out of struggle or habit or a duty or a sense of self, why shouldn't the goal be to be embodied out of a compassion for the world around us? Be embodied because we enjoy and compassion the world around us. Which leads me to one of my final points that I'd like to make today, and that is the study of neurophenomenology. On the right, we have Francisco Varela, one of the most impactful people that I've kind of come across during this exploration. He, along with fellow Chilean botanist Humberto Maturana, really came up with the idea of autopoiesis in the 70s in Chile. And he also really completely invented this form of neurophenomenology. It starts with the basis of phenomenology, which was started by Edmund Husserl in the 1800s, which was really a reaction to objective scientific thought. He felt that science had become too objective and was not taking into account the first-person view of life. He felt that there was a priori essence to the subjective of life. Everything is ultimately seen through our own subjectiveness and first-personness. So Varela really married these ideas of neuroscience, understanding consciousness in the brain through an objective third-person point of view, with phenomenology, understanding consciousness in the brain from a first-person point of view. And he brings the enlightenment of Buddhism into it beautifully. So neurophenomenology is really the phenomenology, the first-person understanding of consciousness, married with the third-person neuroscientific understanding of consciousness. And influencing that is the great meditative insights of both the first-person meditative insights of the Buddhist tradition, as well as the newer understanding of the third-person neuroscience studies of meditation, which in the last 10 years have really blossomed. There's a lot of really great work going on understanding the neuroscience behind meditation. And I have also found neurophenomenology to be a really beneficial tool in terms of my observations in the classroom. Understanding my role in observation in the classroom through both a first-person and a third-person lens. And understanding that in terms of both myself, the child, and the environment. And I think that this whole concept could really lead to much more practical use for observation in Montessori classrooms. Okay, so what does this all mean? Consilience is a term that's very old, but it was really kind of reinvigorated by an ecologist, E.O. Wilson. And consilience is the synthesis of knowledge from different fields of human endeavors. He says it's literally a jumbling together of knowledge by the linking of facts and fact-based theory across disciplines to create a common groundwork of explanation. And throughout my exploration, I've really kind of grasped and held on to this term to give myself a little bit of structure. At times throughout this exploration, I felt myself going off into different tributaries, and I've kind of done so faithfully and hopefully with compassion and understanding that they'll somehow come back together to lead somewhere purposefully and dutifully. And I think that this idea of consilience has been reassuring to me in knowing that approaching something from many different points of view has great merit. So moving forward in some kind of leading questions, I suppose, not only as I finish my program through TIES, but also as I move forward, both just as an individual and as a Montessori teacher. I've identified some questions that are of particular interest to me. One question I have is, how does cosmogenesis guide cosmic education, and is there an inherent value structure to be derived from such a story? What measure of prepotent D needs must be satisfactorily met before the needs of self-actualization and self-transcendence can begin to enter the picture? If children are more comfortable and naturally give up the notion of self, in what ways can that continue to be fostered and held as a value? In what ways do we as adults interfere? There's great studies, a great breadth of studies that show that consciousness and the identity of self for children is radically different than ours. For a couple of reasons. One is that they just simply don't have the autobiographical memory experience that we do. They don't have as much of a story to tell about themselves as we do. Also, their brains chemically and neurologically fire differently. Most of scientists believe that a lot of our concept of self comes from an area of the brain called the default mode network. When the default mode network is on is when we are getting our most strong sense of ourselves. When it is off is when we are experiencing that flow state. Children enter that flow state much, much more easily than we do. And this is very self-apparent to all of us, especially in a Montessori classroom and work cycle. These moments of egolessness, a nice metaphor that I came across was that as we grow older, our neurological pathways become more and more rigid. And this is a good thing, right? This allows us to become really good and skillful in certain disciplines. But it also can force us to become rutted and stuck in certain ruts. And even temporary, even the most fleeting moments of self-transcendence can be like a fresh snowfall on those ruts that allow us to really open up our field of expansion in a field of consciousness. So how can we learn from children, and how can we make sure that we're not interfering with that greater expanse of consciousness that they may have? How can the Buddhist principles of insight, with meditation being a big one, be incorporated into the development of individuals, specifically in the classroom? And how can neurophenomenology influence the curriculum and pedagogy of a Montessori classroom? So here are some resources that I used for this. And I'd like to open it up to any questions. Yeah, please.
You said that you thought of practical ways that it can, this idea of the neurophenomenology influence observation. Can you give, I don't know if it's an example from your classroom or how you...
Absolutely. So in my, so part of the Thai's experience, and it'll be incorporated into my thesis, is videotaping a lecture, or not a lecture, but a lesson that, that I gave, and then going back a couple weeks later and running through it twice. Running through it the first time, completely observing from the third person point of view, only taking down objective anecdotal notes of what the students are doing during that lesson. Then running through it a second time, completely from the first person point of view. What was I thinking in that moment? How was I reacting in that exact moment? And so, and then at the end, kind of tying those together to get a greater picture of that lesson, the environment, everyone involved. And so out of that, it was just a really structured, beautiful way to observe myself in the environment with the students. And I think it really led to some great reflection and results. Yeah.
I like the image that you presented about, it was a science fiction writer.
Yeah, the holons and holarchies. Yeah.
Holarchies, and I think about the way that so much of like adult-child relationships are hierarchical. Like,
Sure.
out of necessity, a lot of the time it's like someone has to tell you that across the street.
Sure.
But I also feel like, I think a lot about like child agency in a Montessori classroom. I'm wondering if you thought about like those implications of a system as opposed to like, you know, a linear hierarchy. Do you feel like it's starting to affect or impact the way that you see your role in the classroom?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. And as I said, I think that these are things that I have been intrinsically interested in for much of my life. I just didn't necessarily have the language or the experience to verbalize that. And so the concept of holon and hierarchies was immediately apparent to me as something that was a useful paradigm. And as I said, you know, at times it can be difficult to talk about because it seems very nitpicky in terms of what are we defining here? We're just arguing over definitions. But I do truly think that if it's taken on seriously as a paradigm shift, it affects not only your interactions in the classroom, but your interactions with any relationships that you have, you know, be it social or environmental. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to verbalize this well,
Yeah.
but you talked about meditation
Uh-huh.
and helping out in the classroom. Have you thought about how you can kind of incorporate meditation but not in a very structural way? So not in a, let's be in a circle and do self-meditation, but how to incorporate it at the individual level?
Yeah, that's something I really do think about a lot, and it's an absolute challenge. It's also something that that I am working out for myself as well. One thing I will say about meditation is that there is, it's hard, but there's also almost immediate benefits. I don't know that I've ever done something in life that has reaped more rewards on such a short journey down the path. And also, I think that through much of the Buddhist teachings, there are different avenues and mental aspects towards meditation, but a lot of it is introspective and looks like sitting still. So yeah, absolutely. I do think about that. But you have to teach math with numbers. Maybe you have to teach, you know, or maybe Amy would not say that, but you know, we have to use numbers in math. Maybe at some point in meditation or self-consciousness, we have to use a dry, if you will, form of meditation. I don't know. Yeah, Jen.
When you talk about the loss of self,
Yeah.
and sometimes in a Montessori environment, like being able to acknowledge that a child is going into that situation of just that flow of
Sure.
material that may not look like what we're supposed to be presenting or how the child's using that material.
Sure.
Have you experienced that in upper elementary classes or in any of your Montessori experience? And how do you, have you chosen to interfere or not? Like, have you mentioned something about how adults can interfere and stop that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think a couple of things. One is I think that looks very different in Children's House and Upper L, right?
Yes.
Like, and part of that is because Upper L students have more of a sense of self than Children's House do, right? There was a really great study done where a scientist, a psychologist was working with 3-year-olds, and they would videotape a lesson that they were working on, and then also doing the same with 5-year-olds. And the 3-year-olds, and during the lesson or during the activity, they would unnoticingly put a sticker on the child's forehead. And then they would watch the lesson 30 minutes later with that child. The 3-year-olds, and the sticker was still on their forehead 20 minutes later when they were walking up. The 3-year-olds would say, look at that, there's a sticker on the forehead, but not go to take it off. The 5-year-olds would take that sticker off. Because the 5-year-olds could acknowledge that I am me, that was me 30 minutes ago, I still have the sticker on my head. The 3-year-olds could not. And so to answer your question, yes, I have thought about that within the aspect of the Upper L. That's always a daily tricky thing about the Montessori classroom, right? Is when to intervene, when not to intervene. And so that is something I constantly think about. But I do think it looks very, very different for the different planes of development.
What's the next step for this?
So I have to finish my 120 pages March 1st. So.
We have 2 days to do it tomorrow.
Is that confirmed? Is that confirmed? Oh, is it? Okay.
So we
all
all
right.
show restraint.
See us all like.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, you were in the flow.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to talk about this any further at any point, and I sincerely appreciate you showing interest in coming out and supporting me in this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.